You are the United States government in the spring of 1861. On paper, you rule a continent. In your treasury, you have $65 million, a national debt smaller than the one George Washington left behind 70 years earlier, and a federal budget of $63 million a year. Half your country no longer recognizes your authority, and it is about to start shooting at the men you send to enforce it. Here's the problem. You have no way to pay for the war you are about to fight. Most people, when they picture civil war, picture generals. Grant's stubbornness, Lee's audacity, cannons, cavalry, Gettysburg. That is a story that survives in textbooks, because it is a story with faces on it. Here is the part nobody tells you. The war was not decided by who had the better generals. It was decided by who could still pay their soldiers, their gun makers, and their creditors in the fourth year of a conflict everyone had expected to end in 90 days. The Union did not outfight the Confederacy so much as it outfinanced it, slowly, expensively, and almost by accident. While both sides discovered in real time that patriotism does not show up on a balance sheet, both sides walked into 1861 making a bet about which resource actually wins a modern war. The Confederacy bet on cotton, a physical commodity it assumed the industrial world could not live without. The Union, almost by default, bet on credit, the far less romantic ability to convince strangers to lend you money today against the promise of tomorrow. Cotton cannot pay an army. Credit can. Money, in 1861, was the one resource neither government actually had enough of, and everything that follows is the story of how that shortage was solved on one side and fatally ignored on the other. Now, let's talk about what it actually cost to get the machine running. Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase inherited a government that had never operated at wartime scale and had no infrastructure to raise the money for it. The national debt stood at $65 million in 1860. By 1866, it had reached roughly $2.8 billion. That is not a war expense. That is a 40-fold multiplication of the entire financial structure of the United States government, done in 5 years, with no modern central bank and no income tax to fall back on when it started. For every dollar the federal government had spent in an average year of the 1850s, the war would eventually demand thousands more, and it demanded them immediately. In the summer of 1861, the cost of running the war alone hit $1.5 million a day. By the time Lee surrendered, that figure had climbed to $3.5 million a day, and the United States had become the first government on record to spend more than $1 billion in a single year. Sit with that for a second. A government that had operated for 70 years on a shoestring was suddenly burning through more money before breakfast than it used to spend in a month. Chase's solution was to sell debt directly to ordinary citizens, and this is where a financier named Jay Cooke enters the story. Before the war, the standard way for a government to raise money was to auction bonds to a small circle of private bankers, who bought low and demanded a discount for the risk. Cooke, a Philadelphia banker who had built his reputation at E.W. Clark & Company before founding his own firm in 1861, convinced Chase there was a faster, cheaper way: sell directly to the public. In February 1862, Chase handed Cooke $500 million in newly authorized bonds and told him to find buyers. Cooke did something no one had done at this scale before. He built a sales network of 2,500 agents, took out newspaper advertisements, and sold bonds in denominations as low as $50, framing the purchase of government debt as a patriotic duty every citizen could afford, and marketing it the way a modern company markets a product rather than the way a government had ever sold debt. Over the next 2 years, his firm sold more than $511 million of it. In early 1865, with the war nearly over and the Treasury still hungry, Congress authorized another $830 million bond issue, and Cooke's firm sold every dollar of it by that summer. For every soldier the Union put in the field, there was a matching machine of clerks, agents, and newspaper advertisements working just as hard to keep him paid. Here is where the war gets interesting. The obvious costs, muskets, uniforms, artillery, are the ones every viewer already assumes. The invisible costs are the ones that actually broke budgets. Horses that needed replacing every few months, rations for 2 million Union enlistees over 4 years, uniforms that wore through in weeks on campaign, and a payroll that never stopped even when the fighting did. A soldier's wage was small. Multiply it by 2 million men and 4 years, and small stops being the right word. Read that again if you need to. 2 million Union soldiers. For years, every single one of them paid, fed, clothed, and eventually pensioned. Union pensions to veterans, which barely registered as a line item during the fighting itself, became the largest single category of federal spending within a generation, second only to the interest on the war debt. The 1860 federal budget of $63 million became a post-war budget that regularly exceeded $300 million a year and stayed there. This was not a one-time bill. It was a permanent restructuring of what the American government cost to run, and the country would still be cutting pension checks to Civil War veterans well into the 20th century. Here is something that almost never comes up. To actually print the money it needed without collapsing its own credit, the Union issued $447 million in paper currency, the famous greenbacks, which covered roughly 13% of total wartime government spending. That sounds manageable. It was not free. Every greenback printed diluted the value of every dollar already in circulation, and Northern prices rose accordingly throughout the war. The North treated this as a controlled burn. The Confederacy, as you'll see, would treat the same tool as a lit match dropped in a powder magazine. Now, let's talk about the costs that looked optional but were not. In March 1863, the Union passed its first national draft, the Enrollment Act, and built into an escape hatch. Any drafted man could pay a $300 commutation fee, more than $5,500 in today's money, and walk away from service entirely, or he could pay a substitute to go in his place. On paper, this was administrative convenience. In practice, it was a price tag on your own life, and only the wealthy could afford to read it. A laborer earning less than $500 a year had no path around the lottery. A man of means could write a check and stay home. The phrase that spread through northern cities that summer was blunt: a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The commutation fee was only half of a much larger system nobody had budgeted for at the start. To keep enlistment numbers up without relying entirely on the draft, federal, state, and local governments all offered cash bounties to volunteers, starting at $100 in 1861 and climbing to $300 or $400 by 1863, with state and local top-ups sometimes stacking a single enlistment bonus above $1,000. For a private earning roughly $13 a month, that was not a signing bonus. It was several years of wages, paid up front, for a single signature. Here's a ratio that shows exactly how this backfired. For every dollar Congress had planned to spend recruiting soldiers, the federal government alone would end up spending nearly $750 million on bounties by war's end, and that money bought Washington something it never wanted: a professional class of deserters known as bounty jumpers who enlisted, collected their payment, vanished before reaching the front, and re-enlisted somewhere else under a different name. One man was documented collecting bounties at least 32 separate times. The system built to save money on recruitment became, in practice, one of the most exploitable line items of the entire war. That resentment over who could buy their way out and who could not was the single unpredictable expense that nearly broke the Union from the inside. In July 1863, the draft lottery opened in New York City, and within days the city exploded. Mobs burned the draft office, attacked the homes of the wealthy, and turned violently on black New Yorkers, whose exemption from the draft, they were not yet legally citizens, became a lightning rod for the fury of white laborers who had no such exemption and no $300 to spare. Federal troops had to be pulled directly from the field at Gettysburg to put the riot down. When the smoke cleared, property damage totaled somewhere between $1.50 and $2 million. Call it $50 million today. And the city government had to authorize another $2 million in bonds just to pay the claims. More than 100 people were dead. This is a cost line no financial ledger from 1861 ever anticipated. The price of a policy so unequal, it nearly detonated the government's own capital in its own capital city. Here is the part nobody tells you. Everything covered so far, the debt, the bonds, the pensions, the bounties, the riots, is the cost of staying in the war. It is the price the Union paid simply to keep functioning as a government while the fighting continued, and it was the wealthier side by every measure. It is not the cost of the war itself. War did not just increase these numbers. It multiplied them, and it multiplied them fastest on the side that could least afford it, the side that had bet everything on a crop instead of credit system. Now, let's talk about how the money was supposed to come back in, because neither government could simply spend forever without a source of revenue behind it. The Union leaned on three levers: tariffs, which had been its only real revenue source before the war, a brand new federal income tax, the first in American history, introduced specifically to fund the fighting, and the bond sales run by Jay Cooke, which functioned less like debt and more like a nationwide investment product bought by hundreds of thousands of individual citizens hedging their savings on a Union victory. Here is the honest math on why none of it was ever enough on its own. Tariffs alone could not scale to wartime spending. Taxation was politically fragile and administratively primitive in an era before payroll withholding or professional revenue service, and bonds only sold as fast as public confidence in the war held up. This is the part that turns finance into something closer to psychology. When General George McClellan hesitated on a battlefield in 1862, bond sales slowed down with him. Not because the Treasury changed its terms, but because ordinary citizens deciding whether to buy government paper were, in effect, voting on whether they believed the Union would still exist to redeem it. Confidence and credit turned out to be the same currency. Lose one, and you lose access to the other, no matter how sound your printing press is. Here's where geography decided almost everything the generals could not. For every dollar of circulating currency and banking capital the Confederate States controlled, the Union controlled roughly 4. The Confederacy held about 30% of the nation's pre-war wealth on paper, but only 12% of its circulating currency and 21% of its banking assets, because Southern wealth was locked into land and enslaved people, assets that could not be liquidated into war material. The industrial gap made this worse in every direction at once. The North ran roughly 110,000 factories to the South's 18,000. It controlled about 22,000 miles of railroad to the South's 9,000, and manufactured somewhere around 97% of the nation's firearms before a single shot was fired at Fort Sumter. The South had bet its entire economic strategy on King Cotton diplomacy, the assumption that Britain and France needed Confederate cotton badly enough to intervene on its behalf. It was not a foolish bet. Cotton had accounted for the majority of pre-war American exports, but the Union naval blockade made it worthless within the first year, cutting off the exports that were supposed to buy foreign loans and the imports the Confederacy needed to back its own currency. Confederate cotton exports fell from roughly 4.5 million bales in 1860 to around 300,000 bales by 1864. The crop the South had built its entire war strategy around had all but vanished from the ledger before the fighting was even half over. Here is the failure sequence, and it is one of the starkest financial collapses in American history. Unable to tax effectively, direct taxes covered less than 5% of Confederate wartime spending, and unable to sell enough bonds in a cash-poor society, the Confederate Treasury did the one thing its own Treasury Secretary, Christopher Memminger, warned was the most dangerous option available. It printed money it could not back. Between January 1861 and October 1864, the Confederate money supply grew roughly 11.5 times over. In that same window, prices did not grow 11.5 times. They grew 28 times over. Read that again. The money supply multiplied by 11.5. Prices multiplied by 28. By the war's final year, annual inflation in the Confederacy had reached somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000%, compared to a rate the Union considered merely uncomfortable. A Confederate dollar that bought a full dollar of gold in January 1861 was, by 1865, worth almost nothing at all. Soldiers' families could not afford bread with soldiers' pay. A wagon load of Confederate notes might not buy a wagon load of flour. Memminger's warning had been overruled by necessity and then proven right by arithmetic. Confederate bonds, still technically outstanding on paper right up until the end, became worthless the moment the government that issued them ceased to exist. There was no receivership, no restructuring, no partial recovery for bondholders. The debt simply evaporated along with the flag that had backed it. On April 9, 1865, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee met at Appomattox Courthouse, and Confederacy's currency died in the same room its army surrendered in. One war, two economies. Only one of them was still solvent enough to keep functioning the following morning. Here is the honest verdict, and it is not a comfortable one. as a financial investment. The Civil War was catastrophic on both sides of the ledger. Union direct expenditures alone ran to roughly $3.3 billion in 1860 dollars. Once you have physical destruction, lost productive capacity, and the economic value assigned to hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, historians' full accounting of the war's total economic cost runs past $6.6 billion, and by some estimates past $10 billion, in an economy whose entire pre-war national output was a fraction of that. In today's dollars, conservative estimates put the total cost of the war above $80 billion. Between 620,000 and 655,000 Americans died. No war before it, and only one war since it's taken more American lives. Judged purely as an expenditure, it makes no economic sense at all. No investor, shown these numbers in advance, a 40-fold increase in national debt, a currency permanently reshaped, more than 500,000 dead, would have called this a rational use of capital. And yet every dollar of it was spent anyway by two governments that each believed, correctly or not, that the alternative was worse. Here is what it actually bought. On the Union side, the forced end of legal slavery in the United States through the 13th Amendment, and the survival of the country as a single political entity rather than two or more competing nations permanently dividing a continent. On the Confederate side, nothing survived the balance sheet at all. Its currency, its bonds, and the government that issued them all ceased to exist in the same week. You cannot put either outcome on a balance sheet in any meaningful way. That does not mean they were priceless. It means the ledger was never really the point. The ledger was just a mechanism both sides used to find out how much they were actually willing to pay for what they wanted. You opened this as a government with $65 million in the vault and half a country in open rebellion against you. You ended $2.8 billion in debt, with a currency permanently reshaped, a tax system that would outlive the war by more than a century, and a bill still being paid out in veterans' pensions decades after the last shot was fired. Across the border you drew in blood, a rival treasury opened the same war with a comparable claim on wealth, and closed it with nothing at all. No currency, no bonds, no government left to honor either. The Civil War was never a war you could win by spending less than the other side. It was a war you could only win by being the one still solvent when the other side ran out of road. In the end, it was not a treasury. It was a debt paid forward, not a bill closed.